Okay, brothers and sisters, I want to discuss the pre-tribulation rapture. So let's get into this. Lately, I've been receiving questions again about various rapture portions. Several of those questions have to do with the claim that in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 to 25, Jesus in effect said the church will have to endure all of the 7 years of Daniel's 70th week, including the Great Tribulation. In this study, I will attempt to show why he could not have done so. Exactly, because the 70th week of Daniel doesn't even fit the context to fit the church into it, because it's clearly explaining to the Jews. The 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, which is Israel, and thy holy city, which is Jerusalem. So, this won't be verse-by-verse study of the Olivet Discourse, but rather a look at the verses within the passage that people use to support something other than a pre-trib view. If you want a verse-by-verse study, you can go to my 4-part series entitled The End Time According to Jesus. It's important to begin any study of this nature with a review of the overall context of the Olivet Discourse, because it is the most important factor in understanding what Jesus was really saying and to whom he was saying it. It will also help us see what was going on in the disciples' minds. It was just a couple of days before the crucifixion. Jesus and his disciples were walking over the Mount of Olives toward Bethany, where they were staying at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. The sun was getting low in the late afternoon sky, casting a soft golden light on the white temple and its surrounding buildings. It was such a beautiful sight. The disciples called it to the Lord's attention. In reply, Jesus said, "Do you see all these things? I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." It was the second time they had heard Jesus say this. The first time was a couple of days early on what we now call Palm Sunday, when he had told the people that because they didn't recognize the time of his coming, the city would be destroyed. He was holding the nation accountable for their failure to understand Daniel chapter 9 verse 24 to 27, where nearly 6 centuries earlier the angel Gabriel had told Daniel of a 490-year period that would begin when they received permission to rebuild Jerusalem and climax in the end of the age. Gabriel told Daniel that the Messiah would come 483 years into that period. Daniel chapter 9 verse 25. Sure enough, here he was standing in their midst, right on time. Right on time. There is no indication from the biblical record that Jesus ever spoke to the disciples about the fact that the coming church age would interrupt Daniel's prophecy and delay its completion by about 2,000 years. In fact, from Acts chapter 1 verse 6, we learn that 40 days after the crucifixion, they expected him to restore the kingdom to Israel at that time. It wasn't until James explained things to them some 20 years later that they understood how Israel was being set aside while the Lord took a people for himself from among the Gentiles. Acts chapter 15, 13 to 18. A word study on this passage will reveal a hint of the rapture, and shortly thereafter, Paul became the first person on earth to present a clear teaching on the doctrine of the rapture. First Corinthians chapter 15, 51 to 53, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16 to 17. Studying, he was revealing a secret in doing so. 1 Corinthians 15 to 51. Therefore, on that afternoon on the Mount of Olives, all the disciples could have known for sure was that 483 years of the 490 years prophecy of Daniel had passed. There were only 7 years left, and Jesus had just told them that the temple, all of its buildings, and indeed all of Jerusalem were going to be destroyed. It must have been quite a shock to hear this, and it promoted forth of them Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, to come to him privately for clarification. Comparing Daniel's prophecy with the Lord himself had repeatedly told them they were beginning to understand that Jesus was about to die, and so the question they asked him had to do with when the temple and the city would be destroyed. What would be the sign of his coming, of his second coming, and of the end of the age, by which I believe they meant the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. Matthew 24, verse 3. These were Jewish men speaking with the Jewish Messiah about the future of Israel. That's why people have to understand. The church wasn't even thought of yet, okay? It was a mystery, as you want to put it, as Paul said, behold, I tell you a mystery. That was a new revelation that came into play where they never even knew about a church because they were all meeting in synagogues at this point in history. It's because of the Jews that rejected Jesus Christ as their Messiah that he's left them aside for now, and God has gone to the Gentiles to call a people out for himself. And once that is completed, once the church is completed, that last Gentile believer that brings in the completion into the body of Christ, then and only then will the rapture of the church take place, and then God will focus back, as his original plan was for the nation of Israel. Because if you go to Romans chapter 11, verse 24 or 25, it says clearly, I desire, brethren, that you should not be ignorant concerning this mystery. Now, what's the mystery? That blindness in part has happened to Israel. You see, blindness in part has happened to Israel. For how long? Well, it explains after. That blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and then all Israel will be saved. You see, God has never, ever, ever worked with two groups of people at the exact same time. That's why Israel's in temporary blindness, and he's gone to the Gentiles, which is the church. He called himself a bride, and once that last Gentile believer comes into the church, becomes saved, comes into the body of Christ, then will the rapture of the church take place, and then God will focus back on the nation of Israel and fulfill the last week that he has planned out for Israel. It's very clear from Scripture. So, these were Jewish men speaking with the Jewish Messiah about the future of Israel. And in his 2-chapter answer, Jesus referred to Israel repeatedly. But never said a single word about a local Gentile church or the amount of time that would pass before the final 7 years were completed. After some general about things that would happen, Jesus gave them this seminary of the future. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now that's very important, because I heard it many times. People said, you see, Jesus can't come back until everybody's heard the gospel. Read that verse very carefully. What is it saying? Look, and this gospel of the what? The kingdom. We're not preaching that right now. We are not preaching the gospel of the kingdom. We are preaching Jesus' death, his burial, his resurrection, and his soon coming. This is clearly talking about the tribulation period, about the gospel of the kingdom, that Jesus Christ is about to come back to set up his millennial kingdom, etc. He's about to come back. Who's going to be preaching the gospel of the kingdom during the tribulation period? The 144,000, the 2 witnesses, and the angels. You can find that in Revelation chapter 7, the 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel. Revelation chapter 11 talks about the 2 witnesses, and Revelation chapter 14, verse 6 talks about the angels. And then the end will come, which is the second coming of Christ, when he comes to judge the world, to judge the nations. He gathers the nations before he sets up his 1,000-year reign. He will judge the sheep and the goats. So, not only is there no mention of the church in this seminary, several of the things he said are not even relevant to the church. They were intended for Israel. For example, it's Israel that has always been hated by all nations because of him. It's Israel that has experienced many turning away from the Jewish faith. It's Israel that has to remain faithful to the end, to be saved. And it is Israel that has been promised a kingdom on earth as a testimony to all nations. What will be the sign of your coming? You see, people have to understand very carefully. That's why it says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, study to make yourself approved unto God, a workman that need not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Now for us that are in Christ, we are never, ever, ever commanded to be looking for signs. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, where it says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. But the Jews require a sign. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 22. Because God's going to be giving them 7 years of signs during the tribulation. That's why Jesus gave them sign after sign after sign. That's why he said to watch when these things begin to happen. Look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh. The redemption that they're going to be saved. Because at the end of the tribulation period, God's going to send his angels to gather his elect, which are the Jewish remnant, the people that got saved during the tribulation period. This has nothing whatsoever to do with the church. But people have to make sure what they're reading is referring to the church or not referring to the church, because everything in the Bible is not written for you, and everything written in the Bible is not to you. Certain things are for the Jews, and other things are for the Gentiles. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is clearly for Israel. And Paul is our apostle. Yes, the stories about the crucifixion in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are for us, yes. But the things that Jesus said to the disciples are not referring to us whatsoever. Because Jesus said clearly in Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, I have not come except to the lost house of Israel. And then when a Gentile woman with a Canaanite, or she was from some other country, Jesus called her a dog. It is not fair for me to throw the crumbs to the dogs. What she did was not right. She called him the son of David, which was only referring to the Jews to call him that. That's why Jesus passed by, and he didn't say a word to her. So I have not come except to the lost sheep of Israel. And then after, in Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus sent his disciples out, what did he say? Go preach to everybody? No, he didn't say that whatsoever. He said, do not go in the way of the Gentiles, but rather go into the lost sheep of Israel. You see, it was all focused on Israel, because at that point in time, Jesus was offering the kingdom. If they would have repented right there and then, he would have brought in the kingdom. But because they rejected him as Messiah, he has postponed that time. That's why there's coming this period that we've called the tribulation, which is really the right term to call it, is the time of Jacob's trouble, when God's going to pour out his wrath and judgment upon the nation of Israel and upon the Gentile nations of the world. That's the real purpose for it. So, what will be the sign of your coming? Beginning in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, Jesus gave the first specific sign of his coming. And once again, it concerned Israel. The abomination of desolation he spoke of requires a temple, indicating a natural presence for Israel in the promised land, with people adhering to their old covenant relationship with God. We now know that hasn't been possible for nearly 2,000 years, but the disciples had no idea. The people Jesus told to flee when they see the abomination would be living in Judea. Historically, the area around Jerusalem, they were told to pray their flight wouldn't take place in the winter, when the weather in Jerusalem can be bad, or on the Sabbath, because covenant-keeping Jews are required, forbidding from traveling on the Sabbath. Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 to 20. Jesus said, the abomination of desolation will be the sign that the great tribulation is beginning. Matthew 24, verse 21. This is a time when Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 1 to 11 tells us two things will happen. All the nations among which the Jews have been scattered will be destroyed, and Israel will be purified in preparation for the promised kingdom. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 11. Jeremiah called this time of Jacob's trouble. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7, which is the Old Testament name for the great tribulation, and said it will result in David becoming their king. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 9, something that hasn't happened yet. The church is nowhere in view here. And in fact, both Paul, Romans chapter 5, verse 9, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10, and Jesus, Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, promised that the church will not be present for this. The church will not be present for this. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the people of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Matthew chapter 24, verse 30 to 31. Some claim this is a description of the rapture, but if that's true, it violates the Jewish context of the passage without any explanation or justification. It also turns the rapture from a signless, secret event into one that can happen until there is a sign for all the world to see. And until the second coming is already in progress, it would mean that while all the world is standing there watching Jesus descend from heaven in power and great glory, he will suddenly snoop up the church and return to heaven without completing his trip to earth. It would also violate his promise made personally and through Paul that he will keep us from the hour of trial that is coming upon the whole world, delivering us from the time and place of God's wrath. Those who see the rapture here claim that the church is the elect, which is a lie. Many of these people believe in replacement theology. They believe that the church is the new Israel, which is a damnable lie from the pit of hell. This has nothing whatsoever to do with the church. Those who see the rapture here claim that the church is the elect. Remember, the church wasn't even thought of yet. It was a mystery. The Lord was talking about, I disagree. Through the Old Testament, Israel was called God's elect, and since Israel was the topic of the discussion, it's much more likely that who the Lord had in mind. Also, according to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 to 3, Israel's resurrection will take place at the second coming, making it possible that Matthew 24, verse 31, is referring to the Old Testament saints being rounded up to receive their resurrection bodies. Finally, there is no mention of the church being the elect in the Gospels. In the only times the Lord mentions the church at all is Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, and Matthew 18, verse 17. He did not use any form of the Greek word for elect. The first clear description of the church as the elect did not happen until Romans chapter 8, verse 33, which Paul wrote over 20 years later. In my opinion, to think that the disciples would have understood the Lord to be referring to the church in Matthew 24:22 and Matthew 24, verse 31 is an underword assignment. If Jesus does not return, there'd be no Jew left. That's what it's talking about. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh should be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. The elect are the Jews, because the second coming is all focused on Israel. So far, in his answer to the disciple, the Lord has given us an overview of the end times. Matthew chapter 24, verse 3 to 14, and then a more detailed chronological order: abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, and the second coming. Matthew 24, 15 to 31. Okay. End of the end of the age. Okay. Beginning in Matthew 24, verse 36, he turns his attention to things that will happen after he returns. These will signal that the end of the age has come, and they provide his answer, their final question. We know this because of the specific way in which he identified the day of his coming as that day and hour, and at that coming of the Son of Man. He was speaking of the day of his return. Some people say that no one will be eating and drinking or marrying and giving in marriage before the second coming, like they were in the days of Noah. They say the terrible effects of the Great Tribulation will have made that impossible. Therefore, Matthew 24:36-39 has to be referring to the rapture, but I think they are missing the point. First of all, people have found a way socializing and get married in the worst of times. But more importantly, I think the Lord's point here was that just as people had no idea the world was about to end in the days leading up to the flood. No man will know the world is about to end in the days leading up to the second coming. And notice how the Lord compared the days before the flood in Noah's time to at the coming of the Son of Man, rather than the days before his coming, the worst time ever to come upon mankind will have just ended. Man's natural destiny after any catastrophic is to believe things will return to normal, but when they actually see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory, they will finally know things will never be the same again. That's why they will mourn when they see him coming. Matthew 24:30. Two men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. Two women will be guarding with the handmill. One will be taken and the other left. These verses are often used to support a rapture after the Great Tribulation. Aside from the fact that seeing them this way violates the context and chronologically of the Lord's message as well as his promise to the church. There are translations problem here. The Greek word translated taken means to receive unto on self, and from of this word provided the clue of the rapture meant in Acts 15:13-18, where it translated taken, take from himself. Acts 15:14. It literally means to take for the purpose of carrying away before the Lord turns back to Israel to fulfill the missing 7 years of Daniel's prophecy. He will take for himself a people from among the Gentiles and carry us away. So the word taken in Matthew 24:40-41 is not a problem, but the word translated left means to put away and was often used in the context of a divorce. Rather than being a description of the rapture, where Paul's different teaching never even mentioned unbelievers, let alone their dispersion, these two verses are a summary of the sheep and the goats. Judgment, Matthew 25:31-46. Both take place after the second coming, and both involve the final destiny of believers and unbelievers who will survive the Great Tribulation and to live to see the Lord's return. Believers will be received into the kingdom, but unbelievers will be put away into a place of eternal punishment. The Lord finished his example of things that will mark the end of the age with several problems that describe the judgments he will connect after he returns. I devote an entire study on the subject of the parables, and that you can read in my two-part posting, Understanding the Olive Discourse Parables. For the purpose of the study, let's just review the clues, as their timing help you see they cannot be meant for the church. Matthew 24, verse 29. Matthew 24, verse 29 begins immediately after the distress of those days and refers to the end of the Great Tribulation. Matthew 24, verse 30 singles the second coming, with more detailed connect in Matthew 24, verse 36 to 44, including the first warning that people on earth will not know the exact day or hour of the second coming in advance. I believe this is due to the fact that both the sun and moon will have gone dark. Matthew 24, verse 29. And it will be difficult to keep track of time. Matthew 24, verse 45 to 51. Corinthians. The parable of the faithful and wicked servants and describes how the Lord will deal with them when he returns. It ends with another warning that people won't know the day or hour of his return in advance. Matthew 24, verse 50. 24, verse 50. Is the parable of the 10 virgins, bridesmaids. The opening sentence begins with, at that time. Everything from Matthew 24, verse 30 forward has been about the second coming. So the pause at that time refers to the time following the second coming. There are many other reasons why this parable cannot be about the church that are detailed in the study I referred above. Like the others, this parable ends with a similar warning about the unknown day and hour of the second coming. Matthew 25, verse 13. Matthew 25, verse 14 to 30 is the parable of the talents. By the opening word again, we know that the Lord was referring to the same time as the previous ones. And in Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 to 46, the parables of the sheep and goats give us the clearest indication of timing, yet it begins with, when the Son of Man comes in all his glory and all the angels with him. As I pointed out earlier, it is the judgment of tribulation survivors, some of whom will be believers and will be welcomed into the millennium kingdom, while the others will be taken away to eternal punishment. Matthew chapter 25, verse 46. The church is the bride of Christ, the most highly regarded group in the history of humankind, and the one with whom Jesus is closest, failing to mention us even once in his discussion of the end times, can only be exchanged by the fact that throughout the Olive Discourse the Lord was focused on Israel and not the church. Therefore, any attempt to use this passage in referring to the rapture of the church requires taking portions of it out of context, and in some cases a reinterpretation of the text necessary as well. The Pre Trib Rapture of the church remains the only portion that is consistent with a literal interpretation of the scriptures. You can almost hear the footsteps of the Messiah. God bless you all, and thank you all for watching. God bless.